Hello everyone. We are here on behalf of the Asia Society commemorating AAPI Heritage and Mental Health Awareness Month. My name is Kanika Chadda Gupta. I am a former CNN anchor and television journalist, host of That's Total Mom Sense, the podcast, and Devoted Mom of Three. And I am here with Dr. Jenny T. Wang. She is a Taiwanese-American clinical psychologist, speaker, and author of Permission to Come Home, Reclaiming Mental Health as Asian Americans. She's the founder of the Instagram community, Asians for Mental Health, which has nearly 100,000 followers. And she's also on the advocacy board of Wondermind, the brainchild of Selena Gomez and Mandy Teefey and Daniela Pearson. She's appeared on countless news segments, ABC, NBC, Good Morning America, Today Show, and we are so excited to have her with us today. Dr. Wang, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to Asia Society for making this event possible.
So today we want to talk about how we can reclaim mental health as Asian Americans. And to set the stage, let's talk about why it's so nuanced and why mental health for Asians as a society is something that should be treated differently. We came here with so many different stories. Those who came in the 1800s during the California Gold Rush, to those who've come on asylum visas, or students here for higher education. There were many different reasons why we immigrated to the US, and we brought along our culture and our traumas. So tell us why we need to really zero in on mental health for Asian Americans specifically.
You know, when you think about mental health, it forms the foundation by which we interact with the world, right? And so when we're coming from different cultures and backgrounds and we're entering into a new country like this, we are carrying with us the stories of our ancestors, right? The experiences of our parents, as well as the fears, the scarcity, the insecurities that come with coming into a country where we are seen as foreigners.
Right.
And so I think as Asian Americans, being able to understand mental health from a different framework that isn't grounded in Eurocentric or Western models helps us also appreciate where we came from.
Yes.
And that these are sources of strength and resilience as well. And so the nuance is hard to find if we kind of say, well, mental health is the same for all people. Because we can't speak to then the unique complexities, the unique narratives that drive how we show up.
Yes, 100%. Now there's 24 million Asian Americans in the US. We make up 7% of the population. And we have been targeted. There's been so much Asian hate over the decades, from the Chinese Exclusion Acts to our post 9/11 world where Muslims and Sikhs were targeted, to COVID-19 and the xenophobia that erupted from that. How do we deal with, this marginalization and really combating the ignorance that exists?
I love how you brought up the history, right? Because I think we have to recognize that anti-Asian sentiment and hate is centuries old. There's nothing new about kind of the feelings that people may perceive when they're around Asian and Asian Americans. And so I think what we need to recognize is that Asian Americans kind of hold this middle space within the black-white kind of spectrum of race. And so when, we are needing to be seen as favorable, we move in closer proximity to whiteness. And when we need to be seen as villains or negative factors on our community, we get moved lower in terms of the social hierarchy.
Right.
And so I think when COVID-19 happened, even after 9/11, a lot of us had to confront that racism was a thing for us. Many of us might have experienced racism or discrimination as children, but our parents perhaps were ill-equipped to have that language, to explore those frameworks, and to build a sense of identity that came from a sense of pride.
Yes.
And so when we think about racial trauma, racial identity, that pride is the protective factor. That connection to community is the protective factor. But for many of us, we might have come to this country and our parents said, no, assimilation is the pathway. And so if your goal that's been taught to you is to be like everyone else, to hide, to be somewhat invisible so you're not a target, then the pride doesn't develop as that mechanism by which then we can say, no, I don't deserve this hate and I need to stand up for myself. And I think that's what a lot of us had to contend with over, the pandemic. We had to say, no, actually, this is something that is not about me being flawed or having something wrong with me. It's about a systemic issue that has preceded me, right?
Yes. And we don't need to explain ourselves, nor do we have to follow the confines of generations past where you're seen, not heard.
Exactly. And I think a lot of times, our parents thought, if you are hidden, if you work hard, but don't stick out, don't rock the boat, that would keep us safe. And in the context of, even our family story, my parents grew up under martial law. People who dissented were often just taken away in the middle of the night. Highly educated individuals who fought for freedom often were stamped down. So my parents were taught at a very young age, do not speak up. Self-advocacy is very dangerous.
Yes.
And so when they move here, they're still carrying that generational trauma. And that's what they taught us, was hide in the shadows, work really hard and succeed, but do not ever come out, and say something that's incendiary or contradictory. And that adaptive mechanism, though, didn't protect my children over pandemic when they were reacted to, in racist ways. And I think our generation needs to say, are those coping mechanisms still effective? Are these the ones that are going to be effective when we teach our own children and how they navigate this post-pandemic world?
Yes. And so how do we equip our children to advocate for themselves and, stand up for themselves when they are being targeted?
I would say that a lot of times our parents, at least my parents, taught this kind of colorblind theory.
Yeah.
We're all the same. We deserve respect, And I think that theory in some ways minimizes then the skill building that's necessary. And so with our own children, even at a young age, we would point out phenotypic differences and say, okay, you notice this, This classmate looks like this on the outside. What does that mean fundamentally, And how does that impact how we might see somebody, Yes. And what does it mean when perhaps this child who is in a wheelchair, for example, What does that mean when people look at this child differently? We're not trying to single out differences as a source of a negative thing. We're trying to say that these differences are apparent and that we have these implicit biases that society teaches us about those differences. And so one of the biggest things is giving our kids the language to say, well, what is race? What is ethnicity? Who am I? In society. And my kids will very proudly say, I am Taiwanese American, And my family comes from Taiwan and I'm Asian. And those were things that I don't feel I was equipped to do at their age,
Yes.
But beyond that, then we can start to teach these ideas around hierarchy. We have that even in age. In Asian culture, age hierarchy is a big deal. And there's a deference to higher levels of hierarchy. Well, guess what? Unfortunately, in the United States, we have race hierarchy. We have gender hierarchy. We have a lot of these ladders and steps. And when we teach our kids that hierarchy is socially constructed, it's not inherent. We aren't born into a hierarchy that is biologic, but it is driven by how society chooses to see people. And as we move up in those rungs of hierarchy, we get granted more power, more privilege. And I think one of the most powerful things we can teach our kids is that in them, they hold certain privilege as well. And with that certain privilege gives you responsibility. So, for example, I was born in Taiwan, but I came when I was 2. So I have the privilege of speaking English without an accent. That is a privileged position. And so when I have that, how do I become aware of individuals who lack that privilege? How do I create space for people who might feel scared to speak up because of an accented English, right? I can be attuned to marginalization and use my privilege to give space for others, right? So I think all of this is a lifelong lesson we teach our kids. As they get older, we start to teach them more about the history, which can be quite traumatic and jarring. So we want to make sure everything that we talk about is age and developmentally appropriate.
Yes, that makes sense. This is brilliant. Tell us about your book. What compelled you to write it?
You know, it was over pandemic. I think it was 2019, 2020. And I was writing all these posts online, just processing, metabolizing racial identity, mental health, all of these themes. And my now book agent reached out to me on Instagram and said, have you thought about writing a book? Because so much of the things I was sharing had kind of tools and skills built around it. And it felt like a very timely season to write it because we were stuck in our homes, right? Nowhere to go, but trying to also understand like what is happening inside of me.
Yeah.
And also what is happening in my relationships. Many of us were kind of stuck in our homes with our family systems. And many of us realized maybe they weren't as healthy as we wanted them to be.
Yes.
And so in some ways I talk about how, you know, I wrote this book because I couldn't not write it. It felt like something that needed to come out. And it was informed by my own life, but at the same time by my work with clients. And every chapter of the book kind of revealed itself with every new client that I took on because it almost felt like we would go through these similar themes. And as they started to grow and to heal, new themes would reveal themselves. So every chapter is a permission that we hopefully can grant ourselves, that we can take more agency and also consider the frameworks that we might want to release from and ones that we want to bring forward.
That's brilliant. And I loved reading it, and I listened to the audio version as well. And the fact that you had these rest stops along this journey that we were embarking on was the perfect reset because we needed to take stock of what you had just discussed and whether it was boundary setting or permission to feel. And it's like, okay, now let's pen down our thoughts. Let's journal. Let's, visualize something like that. So I think it was just really important that you brought in the reader and gave them something that, was a parallel in their own lives to address. And I wanted to go through an exercise with you on that now. So with permission to feel, to start, emotional regulation you've mentioned is really the cornerstone of mental well-being. And once you understand how to really manage your emotions, realize that they're not positive or negative, but you know what to do with them when they arise, that's when you have a sound kind of mental state. So can you help us actually go there with an emotion that we don't like cropping up and how we deal with it head on?
Absolutely. And I talk about this in that chapter, Permission to Feel, where it's almost easier to imagine helping someone else through their emotion regulation. So I often use this example with kids, right? They have all the feels and they're very, very big. And that is such a natural and necessary part of their development. I think for a lot of us, though, growing up, we didn't have that safe environment within which to feel. Sometimes if, let's say, we got angry, our parent got angry in response, right? Or if we felt sad, we were told to just dismiss it. Go eat something, go take a nap. That would fix it, right? And so I think when we do that and avoid the negative emotion, we end up skipping the skill building that's necessary. And so it's interesting because now working with adults, they'll say, I never learned these things. It just wasn't in my framework or language. And when I say in the book that emotions are data, They are the necessary feedback loops that we need about our environment. They tell us to pay attention. They tell us there's something that feels dissonant. They tell you things about other people and yourself. And ultimately, they hopefully motivate action, right? So oftentimes people will get angry or upset, and they'll feel that way again and again and again.
Yeah.
And that's because we haven't heeded the data from that emotion to change something in our lives that prompts that anger, right, over and over.
Yeah, then it's habitual at that point.
Yep, exactly. And so I think all of us perhaps have some strong emotion. Maybe it's resentment, maybe it's anger, maybe it's deep sadness, the emotions that we would rather not feel, right? And so I would invite kind of the listeners to even take a moment, maybe close your eyes, and think of the emotion that you've been kind of hiding away, an emotion that you would rather not feel. And imagine that in your hands, you're holding a glass fishbowl. And now allow yourself to put that negative emotion in that fishbowl. And it might appear as color or swirls, right, of waves or water, something that feels almost very volatile or chaotic. And you might even feel that in your body. Maybe you feel it in a tightness in your chest. Maybe you start to feel some butterflies in your stomach. You feel tension in your back. Notice how negative emotion is a full mind-body experience. You're feeling it in your mind, but your body is also responding to the intensity of that emotion. And now as you hold that fishbowl, now imagine that you are walking around the fishbowl. So you're not in the fishbowl being taken for a ride by this emotion, but you are actually an outside observer of that emotion. You're looking at how it ripples off the sides of the glass bowl. You're noticing how it grows in heat and intensity, perhaps. And you might also notice that as you stay with it and watch it, as you honor that emotion, it starts to calm down a little bit. And this is what I talk about in the book, that our emotions are like waves. And sometimes they're turbulent, they're intense. And in those moments, we feel like we're in the bowl. All we know is the anger or the resentment or the sadness. But the longer you can sit with it, the longer you can breathe deeply through it, you start to soothe the nervous system and yourself to realize, wow, there is a separate consciousness from that intense emotion. And that's when we start to kick on the frontal lobe, the part of the mind that says, I can think about my thinking. I can observe my emotional life. And with that awareness, we can say, oh, wait, hold on. Maybe I don't need to live here forever in this emotion. But actually, once the wave passes, now I can actually understand the why that emotion has occurred, and perhaps the next steps of what I can do to reduce that emotion perhaps from coming back. So allow yourself to imagine that bowl when you feel intensely, and sit with yourself, or even in the beginning, sit with a trusted, safe person. And hold that emotion until the urge and the intensity subsides. You can go ahead and open your eyes again, but you may notice that the longer you sit with that emotion, the intensity starts to lighten up. The grip that it has around even your body might also start to fade away. And that is the act of self-regulation, right? And when we have like infants and children, they can't quite self-soothe, right? And so they need that comfort, that holding. And so in effect, we're teaching ourselves how to hold ourselves through that intensity. And this is in my belief, the core of attachment, right? It is the safe core base that holds you when life doesn't go your way and reminds you that it will not last this intensity and that one day it will also fade and you will come back to homeostasis.
Wow. Oh, that's so transformative. I think when we step outside ourselves, we realize our higher consciousness and how we actually are very much in control.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes when we feel intensely, we feel out of control, right? Because that cognitive mind can't kick on when the feeling or limbic system is trying to survive, right? It feels threatened. Right. And so we have to give the frontal lobe a chance to catch up, right?
Yeah. Now, I want to go through another exercise where you can help us do some scripting because boundary setting, or your chapter on permission to say no, is really important. And I feel like coming from a society where we are deeply filial, it's hard to say no to those who are our elders and our parents. Yes. And we fall into 4 P's that you mentioned. There's peacekeeping, people pleasing, projecting, and protecting. And none of them work. So we need to really refine what we say and how we make someone else feel when we want to set a boundary.
Yes. And I think coming from cultures where we are deeply connected, right? From collectivist cultures, we are taught at a young age that we should be responsible for the emotions of others, right? We don't want to disrupt or upset people, especially if they're elders, right? And in some families or cultures, saying no is a sign of disrespect. Right? It's not even an option to say no or dissent. And so as, bicultural, multicultural individuals, we're straddling those different value sets where in the United States, we might say, no, saying no is good for you, right? You need to.
Right.
And yet you go back home and your family's like, how could you be so disrespectful, right? To say no to an elder. And so when we think about those roles, right, the peacekeeping, people-pleasing, projecting, and protecting, these are the ways that we've evolved to cope with those expectations, right, and the duty and obligation we have towards our family. And so I would say the first thing is pay attention to what role you tend to slide into. Sometimes when we go home for the holidays, we regress to old family patterns.
Right.
So can you pay attention in those moments? Are you a protector? Or are you perhaps an eldest child, eldest daughter? Or are you a pleaser? Or are you someone who said, you know what? For the sake of other people's emotions, let me just give in to what everybody else wants and therefore bypass myself.
You actually mentioned this term in Chinese, swallowing your emotion. What is that?
Yes. So it's in Chinese, it's 吃苦, which is eating your bitterness.
Yes.
Right? And in some ways, right, it's an acknowledgement that sometimes we will swallow that suffering, the pain, the bitterness out of respect and love for our family.
Right.
But I always say to my clients, because this is often a theme that comes up, is how much do you swallow? How much do you bypass yourself? And what does it cost you for that to be your only way of relating to others?
Right. And then the others were project and protect. So, if you're faced with some judgy auntie, sometimes you want to come up with a snide comment to shut her up. Or you protect where you're, coming from, like, I'm not ready to have kids right now, whatever that might be.
Yes. And so those boundaries, right, in a sense are, where do I end and you begin? In a lot of families or cultures, it's very blurry, right? So people feel like they have the right to say, well, why aren't you married yet? When are you going to have kids? Making comments about your body, right, or your weight. They feel as though they have the right to cross that boundary with you because the dynamic has been set up maybe culturally or in your family that way. And in Western culture, we would say, cut that off, right? Don't let them do that.
Yes.
At the same time, in our communities, that could be outright disrespect. Not just as, you as an individual disrespecting, but it is your parents taught you poorly that you would show up with an auntie that way.
Right. So how do you navigate that? Is it like the I statements? What are we doing that it's like, this is how you nip it in the bud? I would say, especially if you're starting off in your boundary setting journey, there is nothing wrong with distraction.
Oh, auntie, you know what? I'm going to go refresh my cup, or I'm going to go to the bathroom, right? Because the thing is, when we set boundaries, and that's not a typical thing for you, it's actually really scary because we risk disconnection. We risk anger. And so that lack of boundary setting is self-protective. Right? And so I always say we don't want to remove a coping mechanism, even if it's not a great one, if there's nothing left for you to pull from, right, to handle that situation. So distraction, right, is an easy way. I would also say, especially for people who go back home for the holidays and things like that, setting boundaries and limits in your time with triggering family members, right? Saying, oh, well, I'm actually going to go to dinner with friends after this family dinner, so I'll be here until 8 o'clock. And then I will be leaving, right? So knowing that and setting that up means that you have, by time and space, set boundaries.
Yes.
Even if you don't feel comfortable speaking the boundary yet.
Right.
And then I would say, as you move up that kind of boundary setting, it might be, a reflection. When you say that about my body, it actually feels hurtful. So I'm not calling out the behavior and saying, this is wrong. You shouldn't have said that. I'm actually letting them know the impact of that action. And sometimes they may not even know because often they think they're doing this out of love, right? I care about you, right? Yeah. And that's why I'm telling you this. But in that, the impact, right, and the intention could be miles apart from each other. And so when we explain very light touch the impact, it might take several attempts at explaining the impact until one day they get it, or they may never get it. And if that's the case, then we have to say, how much harm is it for me, right, to be in proximity with these individuals that continue to hurt me in this way? And maybe I need to limit contact, reduce contact. I've had some clients decide that no contact is a path that they have to take because it's become so toxic to their mental health. So I think there is a spectrum, but oftentimes instead of addressing it, maybe even a light touch, we hide.
Yes.
And when we hide, they have no idea that you're upset or you're hurt. And we also cut off connection implicitly, right? And so there's no kind of like one model fits all because everybody you interact with is so different. But what does it look like to slowly leave breadcrumbs, right? In the hopes that they will understand you, or that you show up in a way that feels authentic and the outcome is on them, right?
Now, what about, the children of immigrants whose parents are so traditional and orthodox? I have a friend I'm thinking of who her parents completely cut her off and disowned her because she married someone who was outside their religion. He was a musician and didn't have the stable career. So that's like a big kind of stigma in our culture. And they didn't want to have anything to do with their daughter anymore. And it's just the most heartbreaking thing. Is there any reconciliation that can come from that?
I think one of the things as children of immigrants that we may have to contend with is the reality that our parents may never be the version of them that we hope for. And in those situations, I think that's when we move towards grief work, right?
Yeah.
An acknowledgement that the life that I had hoped to have, or the relationship that I had hoped to have with my parents, may never be. And when we can grieve that, and we can acknowledge that, sometimes then we can show up with a sense of acceptance. My relationship with my dad, and I write about it in the book, was very fraught. Yeah. And I think it took me grieving that he may never be the emotional connection that I hope for, and he may never show up in a way that is psychologically minded that I need. But once I could let myself grieve that, it allowed me to then open up to the parts of him that he could offer me. And he is a service love guy, right? So he will trim my bushes without being asked. He will change my tires when I don't, say something. That is how he loves. But I think I'd spent so much of my life focused on what he couldn't give and my anger around that I couldn't see what he could offer.
Right.
And so I think, in this example that you've, shared, in that situation, she has to grieve, right? That her parents have chosen values, impression management of the community, perhaps, and the pressures that they're under over her. And that is heartbreaking.
Yeah.
And at the same time, she also has to realize that this life is one that she builds for herself. And sometimes that's when chosen family comes into play, right? The people that we choose to surround ourselves with that offer us a life that is worth living and makes us feel worthy and valued. And we don't always get that from our birth families or our, families that we are, part of. And the grief around that may be lifelong, right? When they have their first child, when they, move forward in life and have milestones, and her parents' absence is felt deeply, that grief resurges again, and we have to tend to those parts of ourselves again and again if we choose to go no contact.
Yes. But then in the end, we have to protect our hearts.
Yes.
I think that's, paramount. That brings me to this model minority, because parents do have this expectation that we're overachievers, and, we're in the US where so many of our lauded CEOs are Asian American, which is incredible to see because they are the thought leaders in tech and healthcare and business. According to the US Census Bureau, the leading cause of death in Asian Americans is suicide for ages 15 through 24. And zeroing in grades 9 to 12, 30% of Asian American Pacific Islander males actually make an attempt. And this is compared to their, counterparts who are white and non-Hispanic. And this makes me think of when I was in undergrad in Boston. I was at Boston University, and just across, the Charles River at MIT, there were always these reports coming out of students who would plummet to their death on Memorial Drive. And I remember being completely baffled by that, thinking these are some of the brightest individuals in our world, not just country, who have the highest potential to reach, and the fact that they felt they had no way out.
Right.
I mean, how does it get to be that catastrophic?
I recently did a talk at a boarding school in Boston, and I had parents do a live poll where I said, what do you value most for your children in their future? And I had things like status, I had things like social capital, I had things like money, stability, well-being, and mental health. And overwhelmingly, everybody said, oh, I care about well-being and mental health. And I said to them, so how many of you are teaching them the skills to build a life that values well-being, mental health? Because the reality is, especially if you're a high achiever, you are actually teaching your children and, the skills of achievement, performance, excellence, none of which are inherently bad. But there is no balance of what that could look like in terms of skill building.
Right.
So think about, if you are a child of immigrants, your parents came to the United States, they worked dry cleaning businesses, restaurants, you saw them suffer, right, to survive and make it in this country. And their one hope is that their child will make it to one of these elite universities, right, to, in effect, pull your family out of that, right, striving and suffering. Then imagine the amount of pressure that young adult now feels, right? To not sleep, to push themselves to the edge, to sacrifice everything such that they achieve the goals that their parents worked so hard for them to attain. Right. And so, when we think about how do people get to that brink, it's often something that they don't notice until it's very, very severe, because they're so good at delayed gratification. They're so good at tuning out aches, pains, migraines, headaches, all of the physical manifestations of psychological distress. And they're really good at ignoring their emotional lives, right? Because when you're in survival, you can't sit there necessarily and cry about how stressed you are. You have to survive.
Right.
So that's often what our parents' generation was teaching. We never saw them take breaks. They worked 365 days out of the year. We never saw them take time for wellness. That was not something that was accessible to them. But now this next generation, which is living in a different context, similarly model what the parents did. So focus on achievement, productivity, excellence, and tying their identity to all those things.
Yeah, I am nothing if I'm not that.
Exactly. I'm nothing if I don't get into that university or get that internship or that job. And so we talk about how we're trying to build resilience in our kids. We will not build resilience in our kids if they never fail until they're 20 or 30.
Right.
And in fact, I would argue that those individuals who have never failed will be at risk for greater mental health distress when they do fail.
Yes.
Because it will mean that everything that they thought about themselves was not real because of this one failure.
Right.
And so I think that part of it is teaching our kids failure is a necessary ingredient to success, that making mistakes is how you build and practice for a future version of you that will be better and more equipped. It is that growth mindset, right?
Yes,
that we love to talk about.
Right.
But we never actually let our kids do.
Yes. Yes.
And so I think when people are pushed to the brink, they start to develop false narratives. If I don't get into that medical school, my parents will be so upset. I'll never be able to face them. How could I have done this? I'm such a failure. Notice the stories that start to build. And then when that child does not feel safe enough to go to a parent, a professor, a teacher, a coach, and say, this is what I'm struggling with, then the shame sets in. And that shame silences their struggle until they feel as though there's no other option, right?
But I think what we can do is be mindful of this and make sure to acknowledge the mental health and well-being at every juncture.
Yes.
I do this with my kids. I have twins who are 7 and a 5-year-old. And my one of the twins, Krish, is very, very gifted in math, and he describes himself as intelligent, and he's like, I always get things right. And we've reframed it. It's like, yes, you have a knack for this, However, we appreciate that you work hard and you're going to make mistakes and missteps along the way, but you're working hard. And let's focus on that, you know. And same with my younger one, when he draws a picture, instead of saying, you know, oh, that's beautiful, or I really like it, then he's just going to keep seeking this external validation from me. I say, so why'd you use those colors? What made you want to draw, you know, Pikachu today? You know, and so it's giving them a lens of, why do I do these things? Right. It's not for mom and dad to say good job.
Right, right. And it is the ability to focus on the process.
Yes.
At being, which is inherently valuable, and letting the outcome take care of itself, right? Because I think sometimes we set up a false myth that if you just work hard, you'll get every outcome that you want.
Right.
Which when they're young, it's probably true.
Yeah.
But there are going to be times where the outcome isn't what you wanted because it had nothing to do with you, right? I have a lot of young adults where every time there's a tech layoff, it's heartbreaking.
They take it personally,
yes. And it's like, no, actually, this is just, right, the current economic climate. And it is not an indication of your value, your worth, or anything. It is that life throws you curveballs that you cannot control. But the people who can say, you know what, I can see that this is part of my process, they can pivot much more easily.
Right.
But those who say, this job, this title, this company was everything and is everything that I am, they will struggle to find themselves because the outcome is what they're going after.
Pegging it on, their self-worth on. And lastly, I want to get into cycle breaking. And by that I mean, we are this new generation that wants to change the narrative as we raise our children, but it's important to hold steadfast to the values that did serve us, because I think we're very, very lucky to have grown up in a collective society. And so I had actually come across this podcast that Dr. Daniel Amen was on, and he spoke about different kind of facets to parenting. And I found this really, really fascinating. So there's loving, hostile, firm, and permissive. And you can be a combination of the two. So the ideal is loving and firm. You want to make sure that, you know, your kids have a safe space with you, but there are still rules and boundaries in place. And the worst would be hostile and permissive, where, you know, that could even be an absentee parent who's not in the picture, or just the hostility, anger, and then letting your kid do whatever they want. But the second worst, which was like eye-opening, is loving and permissive.
Yes.
So we need to make sure that the pendulum does not swing so far the other way as second-gen, third-gen immigrants, where we let our kids, oh yeah, I didn't get to do that, you get to do that. We need to have some kind of demarcation there. How do we do it?
I'm so glad you brought up this point, because I think, you know, especially for individuals who grew up in the hostile, right, permissive, or, you know, environments where there is perhaps abuse, right? In those settings, sometimes those parents say, I'm going to do differently with my own kids. And I'm going to love them in a way where they feel it, they know it. I'm going to be super expressive. But they mistake lovingness, right, as, and in order to love them differently, I need to give them everything they want, and make sure that my only priority is their happiness, right? Because the things that we long most for ourselves are often things we didn't have.
Yes.
So when we didn't have parents who necessarily cared about our happiness or cared about giving us a sense of love, then we're going to crave that as adults. And we're going to want to give our kids that very thing. But when we mistake love as permissive love, we actually cause our kids to feel very out of control. Because what they're implicitly reading is, my parents don't have control over life.
Yes.
And in fact, they don't have a sense of boundaries and limits that make me feel safe, right? And I always use the analogy of a playground, like a playground that has a fence because there's roads all around the playground, it feels safe. But a playground with no fence and there are cars speeding at every, right, like part of that playground, the child now doesn't know how to play freely.
Yeah.
Because they're constantly looking and saying, oh my, what's going to happen if I go out there, right? Or I don't even know if I can keep myself safe because those boundaries are not there. And so our children don't have yet the skills to self-regulate or to take care of themselves or protect themselves. And when parents say, you got this, that's how I will love you, it creates a deep sense of fear.
Yeah.
And so the way to move away from that is to recognize that your boundaries, your limits are an act of love that allows your child to play freely, to learn freely without fearing that they will make a mistake that they can't come back from, right? So in a sense, we build these kind of like bumper rails for our kids. However, we also need to update the bumper rails as they age, right? It needs to get wider. It needs to have more negotiation as they get older. And I think sometimes we forget that as parents.
Yeah.
We just think, oh, we need to control and keep them safe. And then we make the box as small as possible. And in that, our child starts to feel suffocated because they've outgrown that space, right? So I think that pendulum of knowing when are limits necessary, right? Where do we let go, which is part of our job as parents too. It's such a critical kind of negotiation that happens, with our kids. And I think that I always say, that type A parents don't raise type A children, right?
Okay, yeah.
Because as parents, when we overfunction or overdo for our children, they now will underfunction.
Yes.
They'll say, oh, well, mom and dad, they've got it, right? My parents have got it. Now they will reduce their level of ownership and responsibility and skill building.
Yes. Hear that, Gen Z?
So in that sense, right, we need to get clear about what can my child own for themselves so that they can make the mistakes, so that they can problem solve on their own, so that they can build competency and confidence to navigate their life. Yeah. If I do everything for them, when they leave, they will feel a deep sense of, I don't know how to do this.
Yes.
And nobody's going to do it for me.
Exactly.
Or they'll call you from college and say, hey, mommy, you need to call my professor.
Right. Yeah. Oh my gosh. I have a friend who she works in HR and she says, I can't tell you how many parents have called to negotiate their kids' salaries.
Wow.
And it's like, that's a hard pass now.
Yes.
This is something that you definitely have to do on your own. I want to transition to social media because this generation of kids has grown up with it from birth. They are in the digital landscape. They know how to scroll and swipe from age 2 onwards. And that is something that we know all the detrimental effects it has on mental health. How do we give them the tools to know that this is too much, these are my limits, without having to impose them because we want them to be free agents.
Right. And in some ways, I think this is no different than them navigating the world of peer pressure, substances, right? Things that they might do that are maladaptive to cope with themselves and their emotions. Social media is just another example of that process. And so, one of the things I'm always thinking about is how do I build in self-regulation at a young age, right? Because we all know, the college classmates that we had where their parents controlled everything for them when they were younger. And once they got to college and those controls were gone, they didn't know how to handle the day-to-day decision making.
And they went berserk. They were the ones who were like totally off the rails.
Yes. And so one of the things that is important in our family and I talk to clients about is, what are the values that you're instilling at a young age? Things like hard work, things like integrity, things like what kind of person do you want to be on the inside, right? And self-regulation and discipline is part of those values, right? And so in a sense, even my son who's 8 years old and wants to play a game on the iPad, instead of saying you get 20 minutes or this is the time limit, I say, what do you feel like in an appropriate time, right, that you should be playing? What that does is now he has to look inside himself. He needs to pull up the memories of past experiences and conversations and self-determine the time limit. And we push it a step further. We say, if that is the 10 minutes you plan to play, how will you know when the 10 minutes are up?
Yeah.
And so it is his responsibility not to set a timer. And he forgets sometimes, or the timer goes off and we're not there and he keeps playing, right? Because he's so sucked in. And so in those moments, we are also teaching trust. This idea that trust is doing what you say you will do. It's very simple, right, at that age. And in that, we always talk about, did you build trust or did you break trust in this situation? And in doing that, I'm giving him the language, but I'm also giving him the framework, right? That this is a relational thing as well. Even the commitment to only play 10 minutes and to hold myself to it, right? So if we think about social media, not as something to be feared or terrified by, but that it is a perfect model for teaching a lot of these life and growth lessons, then how do we harness this type of scenario and medium and tool to our actual advantage as parents?
Right.
Now, I will say this, your kids, they do not get implicit access to technology. Just for you existing doesn't mean that you automatically have a phone, have a watch, have the game console.
Yes.
Those are privileges to be had. And if that is true, then when your kids come home and they are like, oh, I want to play, well, do they implicitly get that just because?
Right.
Or is there something in which they have gained a sense of trust with you? They have worked towards earning that privilege.
Yes.
Right? And as parents, as educators, as teachers, we have to remain in control. Right? If our kids come home daily and say, I want a phone, everybody is getting a phone. Right. This is not fair. You're ruining my life. I don't know what's happening. And we allow that to shape our decision-making as parents, then we're giving our children, right, control over our choices.
We're being too permissive. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think of, I want to say, I mean, I have young kids, but like, you get a phone when you can pay for one.
Hey, exactly. If that's the limit, then that's the limit.
Or definitely when you have just the mental capacity to know like what's too much. Their prefrontal cortex doesn't form till 25. Right. So, when they're a lot younger, we are giving them this privilege and they need to, manage it. Yeah. This is so interesting.
We have to be mindful that the brain is very plastic at this age, right? In these younger years. And every time they have access to a screen or whatever, it's a dopamine hit. So it's no different than an addiction pathway. And so if we are not mindful of the limits and boundaries, we are changing our children's brains. And their ability to handle that from a neuroscience pathway will be changed. It will be set on a different trajectory moving forward.
Right.
And so what does it look like if, let's say, you have been permissive to say, you know what, we're going to go cold turkey for 2 weeks, right? because of this, right? And we talked about in our pre-call that as parents, our job is to do the uncomfortable, hard thing in the short term to protect the long-term things that we care about. And so what does it look like for us to act on those things now versus going with the status quo and then having to correct it later when those pathways are set?
Exactly. And I think it starts with us. We have to model the behaviors that we'd like to see. So that means not phubbing your kids with your phone. I know we all make this mistake. One more email, one more text. But yeah, it's kind of setting the stage and making sure that, okay, we don't have devices at meal times. We charge our phones at night and we use alarm clocks and we don't need to have them interrupt our sleep, whatever it may be. But set those rituals in the home so that they see that there's no hypocrisy going on.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think my final point is that, in order to parent well or just be a human that shows up well, we have to protect our own mental health.
Yes.
Right? All of this growth and learning and teaching can't happen if we are dysregulated as human beings. And so what can you do today, right? In 10 minutes, 15 minutes to be mindful of your mental health and to give yourself space to acknowledge that piece.
Thank you. I'm going to think of the fishbowl. Thank you so much, Dr. Wang. This was such a pleasure.
Likewise, such a joy to speak with you.